Captain Sarah Chen stood at the viewing window of the transport ship, watching the planet Kepler 442b grow larger in the distance. The world looked peaceful from space, with its blue oceans and white clouds. But Sarah knew better. Down there waited the most dangerous military test ever created. The Galactic Military Consortium had built something they called the Crucible Protocol. Every species in the galaxy feared it. Sarah turned away from the window and walked through the ship's corridors. Her boots made soft sounds on the metal floor. Around her, 200 human soldiers prepared for what might be their last mission. Some cleaned their weapons. Others wrote letters they hoped would never be sent. A few just sat quietly, thinking. Nervous, Captain asked Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez. He was checking his gear for the third time that hour. Miguel had been through hell on Europa 2 years ago. His whole squad died there. The memory still haunted his eyes. Always, Sarah replied honestly. But that's what keeps us alive. The ship speakers crackled to life. All personnel report to the briefing room. Repeat, all personnel to the briefing room. Sarah and her soldiers made their way to the large meeting space. The room was already crowded with beings from across the galaxy. The Veltar warriors stood tall and proud, their blue skin gleaming under the lights. Their species had never lost a battle in over 300 years. They looked at the humans with barely hidden disgust. Near them, the Zephyrians sat in perfect rows. These gray-skinned aliens were known for their incredible intelligence. They could solve complex problems in seconds. Their large black eyes studied everything with cold calculation. They whispered among themselves in their musical language, probably discussing the humans' chances of survival. The chorus shock troops took up the back of the room. These massive, rock-like beings were built for war. Their thick hides could stop bullets. Their strength was legendary. They said nothing, but their glowing red eyes watched the humans with interest. A tall figure walked to the front of the room. Admiral Vextai was a Veltar, his uniform covered in metal from a dozen wars. His voice carried easily through the room when he spoke. "Welcome to the Crucible Protocol," he began. "For centuries, member species of the consortium have sent their best warriors here. Many enter. Few complete the test. Those who do earn the right to lead galactic military operations." He touched the control panel. The room's lights dimmed, and a holographic display appeared above their heads. It showed images of past tests. Soldiers fighting in impossible conditions. Warriors facing their worst fears. Teams breaking apart under pressure. "The Crucible is designed to find your limits," Admiral Vextai continued. "It will test your body, your mind, and your spirit. It will show you things that will make you want to quit. It will put you in situations where victory seems impossible." Sarah watched the hologram change. Now it showed historical scenes that made her stomach turn. Human soldiers in muddy trenches, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Civilians starving in a besieged city, eating anything they could find. Prisoners marching through a jungle, many falling and never getting up again. "We have studied your species carefully," the Admiral said, his eyes fixed on the human section. "We know your history. We know your weaknesses. The Crucible has been calibrated using data from your darkest moments. Your wars, your defeats, your times of greatest suffering." A Veltar officer near the front laughed quietly. Others joined in. Even some of the Zephyrians made their version of amused sounds. The chorus just stayed, but Sarah could see satisfaction in their glowing eyes. "You think this is funny?" asked Lieutenant Emma Vasquez. She was young, maybe 25, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen real combat. "You think you know us because you read some history books." "We know you break," replied Commander Jektar, a Veltar with scars covering his blue face. "Your own records show it. Your soldiers suffer from mental damage after battle. They cannot sleep. They cannot function. Your species is weak of mind." "Weak?" Miguel stepped forward. His hands were steady, but Sarah could see anger in his dark eyes. "You want to talk about weakness? My great-grandfather survived the Bataan Death March. 65 miles on foot with no food, no water, while enemies tried to kill him every step of the way. He made it. He lived. He came home and raised a family." "One example proves nothing," said Dr. Kethrel, a Zephyrian psychologist. His voice was cold and logical. "We have analyzed thousands of cases." Human mental resilience has clear limits. The Crucible will find them. Admiral Vextai raised a hand for silence. Enough debate. You will have your chance to prove yourself soon enough. The first phase begins in 6 hours. Use that time to prepare. Those who survive the first day may continue. Those who do not will be returned to their ships. The briefing ended. Different species filed out in their own groups, most avoiding the humans entirely. Sarah gathered her officers around her. "What do you think, Captain?" asked Emma. "They seem pretty confident they can break us." Sarah looked at her team. Miguel with his haunted eyes but steady hands. Emma with her youth and fierce determination. Corporal James Park, who had lost his arm on Titan but learned to fight better with one hand than most people could with two. Sergeant Maria Santos, whose family died in the colony attacks but who still fought to protect others. "They made a mistake," Sarah said quietly. "They think they know our breaking point because they read about our worst days, but they don't understand something important." "What's that?" Miguel asked. "Those worst days? We survived them. We learned from them. Every terrible thing in our history, we found a way to live through it and come out stronger." Sarah looked each of them in the eyes. "They're about to test us with things we've already beaten." The group nodded. Around them, other human soldiers prepared in their own ways. Some prayed. Others exercised. A few played cards to stay calm. All of them carried the weight of human history on their shoulders. 6 hours later, the transport ships reached the planet's surface. The Crucible facility stretched across the landscape like a metal city. Its towers reached into the gray sky. Its walls were thick and windowless. Somewhere inside those walls waited tests designed to break the human spirit. Sarah Chen led her soldiers toward the entrance. Behind them walked warriors from across the galaxy, all confident in their own abilities, all certain that the humans would be the first to fail. None of them realized they were about to learn something new about the species they thought they understood. Something about what humans do when faced with their own history. Something about how the weak become strong by refusing to stay broken. The Crucible facility was larger inside than it looked from the outside. Sarah Chen walked through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were made of some gray metal that absorbed sound. Her footsteps echoed anyway, mixing with the sounds of hundreds of other soldiers moving through the maze-like structure. "First phase begins in 30 minutes, announced a voice from speakers hidden in the walls. "Report to your assigned zones. Failure to comply will result in immediate elimination." Sarah checked her tablet. Zone 7. She looked at her team and saw they had different zone numbers. The Crucible was splitting them up from the start. Divide and conquer. It was an old strategy, but effective. "Stay sharp," she told them. "Remember what we talked about. This is just another day at the office." Miguel nodded. His zone was 9. Emma got zone 3. They would be scattered across the facility, facing unknown tests alone. Sarah watched her people walk away, then headed toward her own assignment. Zone 7 turned out to be a large room with white walls and bright lights. 15 other beings stood inside, waiting. Sarah recognized some of them from the briefing. 3 Veltar warriors, their blue skin looking pale under the harsh lighting. 2 Zephyrians, their black eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. 4 Korath, their massive forms taking up most of the space. The rest were species she did not know well. The light suddenly dimmed. The white walls changed, becoming screens that showed images. Sarah found herself looking at a perfect recreation of a World War I battlefield. Mud stretched in every direction. Dead trees stuck up like broken bones. The sound of artillery fire rolled across the landscape like thunder. "Scenario 1, said a hidden voice. "Advance across no man's land. Capture the enemy position. Acceptable losses, 30%. A door opened in the far wall. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of mud and death. Sarah had studied the old wars in school. She knew what those trenches meant. Millions of young men had died in places just like this one. The Veltar warriors looked at each other and smiled. This was their kind of fight. Direct assault. Simple tactics. They charged through the door without hesitation, war cries echoing behind them. Sarah heard gunfire immediately, then screams. The Veltar had run straight into machine gun fire, just like human soldiers had done 100 years ago. The difference was that human soldiers had learned from those mistakes. The Veltar was still learning. The Zephyrians approached more carefully. They calculated angles and distances. They used their tablets to plan the best routes. But when they moved forward, the same thing happened. The simulation had no respect for logic or planning. It was designed to break spirits, not reward intelligence. Sarah waited. She watched the others charge, one by one. Each group thought they could solve the puzzle through strength or intelligence or endurance. Each group failed in the mud and wire. When it was her turn, Sarah did something different. She walked to the edge of the trench and sat down. She took out a small notebook and started writing. "Soldier, advance immediately or face elimination," the voice commanded. "I am advancing," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm advancing my understanding of the situation." She wrote for 5 minutes. Notes about the machine gun positions. Observations about the timing of artillery shells. Comments about wind direction and visibility. Then she stood up and started moving. But she did not charge like the others. She crawled. She used shell hole for cover. She moved when the guns were reloading. She advanced yard by yard, patient and careful. It took her 2 hours to cross the field that others had tried to cross in minutes. When she reached the enemy position, she found it empty. The test had ended the moment she showed that she understood what no man's land really was. It was not a problem to be solved with courage or intelligence. It was a lesson about the cost of learning the hard way. In Zone 9, Miguel faced a different scenario. The room became a jungle. Hot, humid air filled his lungs. Insects buzzed around his head. The voice told him his squad was missing. He had to find them and bring them home. Miguel knew this test too. It was based on the Bataan Death March, on Vietnam, on every time soldiers had been lost in hostile territory. The simulation showed him bodies in the jungle. Some wore human uniforms. The voice whispered that he had failed his team again, just like on Europa. But Miguel had learned something on Europa that the test designers did not understand. He had learned that sometimes the only victory is survival. Sometimes bringing yourself home is the most important mission of all. He found the missing soldiers in the simulation. They were injured, dying, begging for help. The test wanted him to try to save them all, to spread himself too thin, to fail again. Instead, Miguel made the hardest choice a soldier can make. He saved the ones he could save. He left the ones who were already gone. She wrote for 5 minutes. Notes about the machine gun positions. Observations about the timing of artillery shells. Comments about wind direction and visibility. Then she stood up and started moving. But she did not charge like the others. She crawled. She used shell hole for cover. She moved when the guns were reloading. She advanced yard by yard, patient and careful. It took her 2 hours to cross the field that others had tried to cross in minutes. When she reached the enemy position, she found it empty. The test had ended the moment she showed that she understood what no man's land really was. It was not a problem to be solved with courage or intelligence. It was a lesson about the cost of learning the hard way. In Zone 9, Miguel faced a different scenario. The room became a jungle. Hot, humid air filled his lungs. Insects buzzed around his head. The voice told him his squad was missing. He had to find them and bring them home. Miguel knew this test too. It was based on the Bataan Death March, on Vietnam, on every time soldiers had been lost in hostile territory. The simulation showed him bodies in the jungle. Some wore human uniforms. The voice whispered that he had failed his team again, just like on Europa. But Miguel had learned something on Europa that the test designers did not understand. He had learned that sometimes the only victory is survival. Sometimes bringing yourself home is the most important mission of all. He found the missing soldiers in the simulation. They were injured, dying, begging for help. The test wanted him to try to save them all, to spread himself too thin, to fail again. Instead, Miguel made the hardest choice a soldier can make. He saved the ones he could save. He left the ones who were already gone. The simulation ended when Miguel demonstrated that he understood the difference between heroism and martyrdom. In Zone 3, Emma faced urban warfare. The room became a city under siege. Civilians ran through the streets, desperate and frightened. Enemy snipers fired from windows. The test wanted her to choose between military objectives and civilian safety. Emma had grown up hearing stories from her great-grandfather about Normandy, about Stalingrad, about every city that had become a battlefield. She knew that in real war, there were no clean choices. There were only choices you could live with. She organized the civilians into groups. She used them to help spot snipers instead of treating them as obstacles. She turned the city's defenders into her allies instead of trying to fight alone. The simulation was designed to make her feel helpless, but Emma had learned that helplessness was just another word for not asking for help. Across the facility, similar scenes played out. The crucible threw humanity's worst memories at the human soldiers. Starvation, disease, impossible odds, moral choices with no right answers. Each test was designed to break the human spirit by forcing them to relive their species' greatest failures. But something unexpected was happening. The humans were not breaking. They were adapting. Each terrible scenario was something their ancestors had already faced. Each impossible choice was one their people had already made. The alien observers watched in growing confusion as their carefully designed tests failed one by one. The Veltar who had survived the first test stopped laughing. The Zephyrians began recalculating their predictions. Even the massive chorus started paying closer attention to what the humans were doing. Dr. Kethril stood in the observation deck, studying his readings. The human stress responses were all wrong. They should have been panicking, breaking down, giving up. Instead, they were calm, focused. They approached each terrible scenario like they had seen it before. "How are they doing this?" asked Commander Jektar. "These scenarios are based on their own historical traumas. They should be devastated." Dr. Kethril did not answer immediately. He was beginning to understand something that terrified him. The humans were not reliving their traumas. They were using them. Every terrible experience in human history had become a lesson. Every failure had become wisdom. The Crucible was not testing the humans. It was revealing them. And what it revealed was a species that had already passed every test that mattered. By the third day, half the non-human participants had been eliminated from the Crucible. The Veltar warriors, once so proud and confident, now moved with uncertain steps. 3 of their strongest fighters had broken down completely during the siege scenarios. They sat in the medical bay, staring at nothing, their minds unable to process what they had experienced. The Zephyrians fared no better. Their logical approaches failed when faced with problems that had no logical solutions. Dr. Kethril watched his own people struggle with growing alarm. These were beings who could calculate the movement of stars, but they could not understand why humans shared their food with strangers during starvation simulations. Even the mighty Chorus was showing cracks. Their incredible physical strength meant nothing when the test attacked their minds and spirits. 2 of their shock troops had attempted to quit the program entirely, something unheard of in their warrior culture. But the humans continued to adapt and survive. Sarah Chen found herself in what the Crucible called the Endurance Chamber. The room recreated the siege of Leningrad, complete with the bone-deep cold and the gnawing hunger that had lasted for 900 days. She was given minimal rations and told to survive for as long as possible. The test was designed to break human will through slow starvation. The alien designers had studied records of the siege, where over 1 million people had died from hunger and cold. They expected Sarah to panic, to hoard her food, to become desperate and weak. Instead, Sarah did something that confused the observers. She found the other participants in her test group and started organizing them. A young Veltar warrior named Kexhan was already showing signs of breakdown. His species had never known real hunger. The concept of rationing was foreign to him. "Hey," Sarah said, giving him half of a daily bread ration. "Eat slowly. Make it last." "Why are you helping me?" Kexhan asked. His voice shook with confusion. "We are competitors." "No," Sarah replied simply. "We are survivors, and survivors help each other survive." She taught him to eat snow for water. She showed him how to keep his body warm by moving just enough to maintain circulation, but not enough to waste energy. She shared stories to keep their minds occupied, tales of her grandmother who had lived through the Dust Bowl in America, when crops failed and families had to choose between staying and starving or leaving everything behind. The Zephyrian in their group, a scientist named Velquin, watched this behavior with fascination. "Your actions are not logical," he observed. "Helping him reduces your own chances of success." Sarah smiled. My great-grandmother used to say that there are two ways to be rich. You can have more than everyone else, or you can make sure everyone has enough. The second way is harder, but it lasts longer. By the end of the week, their test group had become a small community. They shared resources, took turns keeping watch, and supported each other through the worst moments. When the simulation finally ended, all three of them had survived longer than any previous group in Crucible history. Meanwhile, Miguel faced the isolation protocol. He was locked in a small room with no windows and minimal lighting. The voice told him his rescue was coming, but days passed with no sign of help. The test was designed to break human spirits through loneliness and hopelessness. The room played sound from his worst memories. The screams of his squad mates dying on Europa. The explosion that had taken his best friend. The silence that followed when Miguel realized he was the only one left alive. But Miguel had learned something during his recovery from Europa. He had learned that isolation was only unbearable if you fought it. Instead of trying to escape the memories, he let them come. He remembered his friends not just as they died, but as they lived. He told their stories to the empty room, keeping their memory alive. Martinez loved baseball, he said to the darkness. He could recite statistics from games played 50 years before he was born. Always said he was going to coach kids when he got out of the service. He talked about Johnson, who collected old books and read poetry when he thought no one was listening. About Williams, who sent half his pay home to his sister so she could go to college. About Davis, who could fix anything mechanical but could not figure out how to ask a girl in communications on a date. The isolation chamber was designed to drive people insane with loneliness. Instead, Miguel filled it with the voices of friends who were gone but not forgotten. The test ended when the monitors showed that his stress levels were actually decreasing instead of increasing. Emma faced perhaps the cruelest test of all. The moral choice simulator put her in command of a refugee evacuation. She had limited transport and unlimited civilians who needed rescue. The simulation forced her to choose who lived and who died. Every choice was designed to be impossible. Save the children but leave their parents. Rescue the healthy but abandon the wounded. Take the adults who could work but leave the elderly who could not. Emma had heard these stories before. Her family had lived them. Her great-grandfather had been at Dunkirk, where impossible choices were made every day. Her grandmother had worked in refugee camps after World War II, where resources were always too little and need was always too great. The simulation expected her to break down under the weight of impossible decisions. Instead, Emma did what her family had taught her to do. She refused to accept the premise that some people were worth more than others. She organized the refugees into teams. The healthy helped carry the wounded. The adults taught skills to the children. The elderly shared wisdom about surviving hard times. Instead of choosing who to save, Emma found ways to save more people by having them save each other. When the transport arrived, it carried twice as many refugees as the simulation had predicted was possible. The test ended with a notation that had never appeared before. Subject rejected parameters and exceeded expectations. Dr. Kethrell stood in the observation center, surrounded by data he could not understand. Every prediction about human behavior had been wrong. Every carefully calculated breaking point had become a starting point for something stronger. They are not responding correctly, complained Admiral Vextai. The tests are based on their own historical data. They should be suffering from the same traumas that broke their ancestors. No, said Commander Jektar quietly. His scarred face showed new respect as he watched the human survivors help each other through the latest challenge. We misunderstood the data. Their ancestors were not broken by these experiences. They were shaped by them. Dr. Kethrell nodded slowly. We designed the Crucible to exploit their weaknesses, but we failed to understand that their greatest weakness had already become their greatest strength. On the screens before them, human soldiers continued to do the impossible. They turned competitors into allies. They found hope in hopeless situations. They carried each other through tests designed to be faced alone. The Crucible was revealing something terrifying to the alien observers. Humanity had not just survived its darkest chapters. It had learned from them. Every tragedy had become a lesson. Every defeat had become wisdom. Every moment of suffering had become a tool for helping others suffer less. The humans were not just passing the tests. They were rewriting them. The final phase of the Crucible began on the 10th day. Only 37 participants remained from the original 300. 23 of them were human. The alien observers had stopped making jokes about human weakness. Now they watched in silent amazement as the species they had tried to humiliate continued to exceed every expectation. Admiral Vextai called an emergency meeting of the consortium leadership. The conference room buzzed with worried voices in a dozen languages. The crucible was not going according to plan. "This is unacceptable," declared General Thekvar the Korath. His massive form dominated one end of the table. "The humans are making our finest warriors look like children. How do we explain this to the Consortium Council?" "Perhaps we should consider that our initial assessment was incorrect," suggested Dr. Kethrel. The Zephian scientist had been studying human behavior for days now. Every data point challenged everything he thought he knew about their species. "Incorrect." Admiral Vextai's blue skin darkened with anger. "We based our projections on their own historical records. Wars where millions died, famines that lasted for years, plagues that wiped out entire populations. These are documented facts." "Yes," Dr. Kethrel replied quietly, "but we focus on the dying and ignore the surviving. We calculated the casualties but not the recoveries. We measured the damage but not the healing." In the crucible chambers below, the final test was beginning. The surviving participants found themselves in the most challenging scenario yet, the sacrifice protocol. Each person was given command of a small unit facing an impossible mission. Success required someone to stay behind and hold off enemy forces while the others escaped. It was a scenario based on humanity's most painful military traditions, from Thermopylae to the Alamo to the countless unknown battles where someone had to die so others could live. Sarah Chen stood in a recreation of a bombed-out city. Her team consisted of 5 beings, 2 humans, 1 Veltar, 1 Zephian, and 1 Korath. They had been told that enemy forces were approaching and would overrun their position in 30 minutes. A transport ship could evacuate 4 people safely. The 5th would have to remain behind to delay the enemy. The other species looked at each other with barely concealed fear. This was the test they had all dreaded. Someone had to volunteer to die. Someone had to make the ultimate sacrifice. "I will stay," announced Kexhan, the young Veltar warrior who had been in Sarah's survival group. "It is the honorable thing to do." "Honor has nothing to do with it," replied Velquin, the Zephian scientist. "We should calculate who has the best chance of successfully delaying the enemy forces." The Korath warrior, Grokmar, said nothing but moved toward the defensive position. His people valued strength above all else. Staying behind to fight impossible odds appealed to his warrior nature. But Sarah was thinking about something else entirely. She was remembering stories her father had told her about his grandfather, who had served in World War II. Stories about soldiers who found ways to complete impossible missions by refusing to accept that someone had to die. "Nobody stays behind," Sarah said quietly. The others stared at her. "Captain, the parameters are clear," Velquin protested. "The mathematics are simple. 5 people cannot evacuate on a transport designed for 4. "The mathematics assume we accept the enemy's timeline," Sarah replied. "What if we change the timeline?" She moved to the building's upper floors and started setting charges, not to destroy the enemy, but to bring down sections of the building in a controlled way. The falling debris would create choke points and barriers, slowing the enemy advance but not stopping it permanently. "Emma, Miguel," she called her fellow humans. "Remember the stories about the French resistance? Small groups, hit-and-run tactics." Emma smiled. She understood immediately. You want to harass them instead of fighting them head-on. "Exactly. We don't need to stop them. We just need to slow them down long enough for all of us to reach the second evacuation point." The plan was dangerous and complex. Instead of one person making a heroic last stand, all 5 would work together to delay the enemy through mobility and misdirection. They would leapfrog backwards through the city, setting up temporary defensive positions and then abandoning them before the enemy could respond effectively. Kexhan was confused. But this is not how war is fought. Someone must hold the line. Someone must sacrifice himself for the greater good. "Why?" asked Miguel. "Who says that's the only way? My ancestors tried the heroic last stand approach for thousands of years. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. Then they learned something better." "What did they learn?" asked Grokmar. That the best way to honor sacrifice is to avoid needing it in the first place, Sarah replied. The plan worked. Moving fast and staying together, the team delayed the enemy forces for over an hour while retreating to the secondary evacuation site. All 5 escaped safely. The simulation ended with another notation that had never appeared before. Subject team rejected acceptable losses and achieved 0 casualties. Similar scenes played out across the facility. Human teams consistently found ways to complete missions that other species approached with resignation and acceptance of loss. They refused to see sacrifice as inevitable. They treated impossible odds as problems to be solved rather than fates to be accepted. In the observation center, the alien commanders watched their carefully designed scenarios being rewritten in real time. The humans were not just surviving the tests. They were fundamentally changing how the tests could be approached. They are teaching the others, observed Dr. Kethril. Look at the Veltar warrior. He is starting to question assumptions about honor and sacrifice. The Zephyrian is beginning to factor hope into her calculations. Even the Korath is learning that strength can be something other than individual heroics. Admiral Vextai studied the displays showing team performance statistics. The mixed teams led by humans were outperforming pure species teams by enormous margins. It was not that humans were individually superior. It was that they approached problems differently. How do they do it? He asked, his voice filled with grudging respect. How do they consistently find solutions that our strategists miss? They have already faced these scenarios, replied General Thekvar. The massive Korath leader had been quiet for most of the meeting, but now his voice carried a note of understanding. Not in simulation, but in reality. Their species has lived through every horror we can imagine, and many we cannot. They have already learned the lessons we are trying to teach. Dr. Kethril nodded. We designed the Crucible to break them by forcing them to relive their worst memories. But those memories are not sources of weakness. They are sources of wisdom. Every tragedy in human history became a lesson in how to face the next tragedy. Every defeat became knowledge about how to achieve victory. The final day of the Crucible arrived. 25 participants remained, and 20 of them were human. But more importantly, the 5 non-humans who remained had all been part of mixed teams led by human commanders. They had learned something that their own species training had never taught them. They had learned that there was almost always another way. That sacrifice might be noble, but survival was better. That the greatest strength was not the ability to endure suffering alone, but the wisdom to prevent others from having to suffer at all. The Crucible Protocol was designed to identify the galaxy's finest military leaders. Instead, it had become a classroom where humanity taught the rest of the galaxy what they had learned in the long climb from barbarism to the stars, that what breaks you can also make you stronger if you refuse to stay broken. The Crucible Protocol officially ended at dawn on the 15th day. 25 beings stood in the final assembly hall, but they were not the same individuals who had entered 2 weeks earlier. The humans looked tired but unbroken. More surprisingly, the 5 non-human survivors looked different too. They stood straighter, with new confidence in their eyes. Captain Sarah Chen faced Admiral Vextai across a table covered with test results and performance charts. The numbers told a story that no one in the Galactic Military Consortium had expected to see. 92% human survival rate. The Admiral read aloud. His voice carried no emotion, but Sarah could see the struggle in his blue eyes. 0 permanent psychological casualties. Team performance ratings exceed all previous records by an average of 300%. He set down the tablet and looked directly at Sarah. Explain this to me, Captain. How did your species turn our most difficult test into what appears to be a training exercise? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Around the room, other consortium officials waited for her response. Some looked angry. Others seemed confused. A few, like Dr. Kethril, watched with genuine curiosity. With respect, Admiral, I think you asked the wrong question, Sarah replied. The question is not how we pass your test. The question is why you thought your test would be difficult for us. We base it on your own historical traumas, protested Commander Jektar. Your wars, your famines, your disasters. These are documented sources of human suffering. Yes, Sarah agreed. They are. But you missed something important about those documents. They were written by survivors. Every story of human suffering is also a story of human endurance. Every record of tragedy is also a record of recovery. General Thekvar leaned forward in his chair. The massive Korath warrior studied Sarah with new interest. You are saying we misunderstood your history. You understood the fact but missed the meaning, Sarah explained. When you read about the siege of Leningrad, you saw 1,000,000 deaths. We see a city that refused to surrender. When you studied our wars, you counted casualties. We remember the soldiers who found ways to bring their friend home. Dr. Kethril spoke up from his corner of the room. The psychological profiles we developed focused on human trauma responses. We documented stress reactions, mental breakdowns, and emotional damage. These are real phenomena with quantifiable effects. They are, Miguel said, stepping forward to join the conversation. I have seen those effects personally, but you made a critical error in your analysis. What error? Dr. Kethril asked. You treated trauma like a permanent disability instead of a learning experience, Miguel replied. Yes, humans suffer when bad things happen to us. But we also learn. We adapt. We grow stronger. Emma joined them at the table. My great-grandfather used to say that pain is the price of wisdom. The more you pay, the smarter you get. Humanity has been paying that price for thousands of years. Admiral Vextai was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of respect that had not been there before. Are you saying that your species' suffering made you stronger? Not the suffering itself, Sarah corrected. The recovery from suffering. The choice to keep going when everything seems hopeless. The decision to help others even when you can barely help yourself. Those choices, made over and over again across thousands of years, shaped who we became. She gestured toward the other survivors in the room. Kexan stood next to Corporal Park, discussing something in quiet voices. Vel Quinn was showing Sergeant Santos' calculations on her tablet. Grok Ma sat with Lieutenant Torres, both of them cleaning their weapons with the careful attention of professional soldiers. Look at them, Sarah continued. 2 weeks ago, they barely spoke to each other. Now they work together like they have been teammates for years. That is what humans do. We turn strangers into family. We turn competitors into allies. We turn impossible situations into problems that can be solved. General Thekvar stood up slowly. His massive form cast a shadow across the table. Captain Chen, I owe you an apology. My people believed we understood strength. We thought strength meant enduring pain without showing weakness. You have taught us that true strength means helping others endure their pain. And helping them avoid unnecessary pain in the first place, added Emma. Dr. Kethril was taking notes on his tablet, his black eyes reflecting the room's lights. This changes everything we thought we knew about military psychology. If trauma can become wisdom, if suffering can teach resilience, then our entire approach to warrior training needs to be reconsidered. Maybe, Sarah said carefully, but remember that wisdom earned through suffering is expensive. Just because we can learn from tragedy does not mean we should seek it out. The goal should always be to learn the lessons without paying the full price. Admiral Vextai activated a communication device on the table. This is Admiral Vextai to Consortium Command. The Crucible Protocol evaluation is complete. Recommendation: immediate revision of military training procedures across all member species. Further recommendation: establishment of human-led integration program for mixed species units. A voice crackled through the speaker. Admiral, are you saying the humans pass a test? Vextai looked at Sarah and her team. Then he looked at the non-human survivors who had learned to work alongside them. Finally, he looked at the test result that showed impossible achievements accomplished through cooperation and creative thinking. No, he said finally. I am saying the humans have made our test obsolete. They did not just pass it. They improved it. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Chen stood in the same transport ship that had brought her to Kepler 442b. But this time, she was not a test subject. She was an instructor. Behind her, 24 Veltar warriors, 30 Zephyr strategists, and 18 Chorus shock troops prepared for their first day of integrated training. The Crucible Protocol still existed, but it had been completely redesigned. Instead of trying to break spirits, it now taught resilience. Instead of testing individuals, it built teams. Instead of accepting that some challenges required sacrifice, it trained leaders to find solutions that saved everyone. Miguel Rodriguez had been promoted to training commander for psychological resilience programs. He worked with beings from across the galaxy, teaching them that trauma was not the end of the story but the beginning of wisdom. Emma Vasquez led the Tactical Innovation Department, where mixed species teams learned to approach problems from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Her motto, painted on the wall of her office, read, "There's always another way." The Galactic Military Consortium had learned something important about humanity. They had discovered that the species they tried to humble was actually their greatest teacher. Humans had been through the crucible already. They had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of helping others through their own dark times. In the end, the test designed to prove human weakness had instead revealed human strength. Not the strength to endure suffering, but the strength to transform suffering into wisdom. Not the strength to accept defeat, but the strength to redefine victory. Not the strength to survive alone, but the strength to make sure no one had to. The humans had taken what was meant to break them and used it to lift up everyone around them. They had stretched where others expected them to snap. And in doing so, they had taught the galaxy a lesson that would echo through the stars for generations to come. What once broke them, they had learned to stretch with, and now they were teaching everyone else to do the same.